I stood amidst the elite at the Ravenwood Club, the air thick with the scent of $200 scotch and old money. Julian Voss, my sister's billionaire fiancé, looked at me like I was a red wine stain on an antique rug. He began barking orders in formal Old Norwegian, a weaponized dialect meant to strip me of my dignity before his global peers. The room rippled with practiced laughter. But they didn't realize I wasn't just listening. I was translating his downfall. My name is Melody Powell, and at 31 years old, I had mastered the art of being part of the furniture. Standing in the center of the Ravenwood Club in Washington, D.C., I felt less like a guest and more like a structural error in the architecture of the evening. The chandeliers above us did not cast a warm glow. They hung like clusters of diamond-tipped daggers, waiting for gravity to do its work. The light they threw was sharp, forensic, and unforgiving. It caught the edges of crystal flutes and the overly whitened teeth of senators and lobbyists, but it seemed to slice right through me. I held a glass of sparkling water that I had no intention of drinking. I simply needed something to occupy my hands so they would not curl into fists. The room smelled of expensive cologne, old leather, and the specific, metallic scent of power that has never been told no. Julian Voss stood 10 feet away from me. He was the center of gravity in this room, a black hole wrapped in a $5,000 bespoke suit. He was my younger sister's fiancé, a man whose family name was etched onto hospital wings and university libraries across the East Coast. To the rest of the world, Julian was a titan of industry, a golden son of the capital. To me, he was a predator who had learned to wear a smile like a camouflage net. He looked at me then. It was not a look of recognition. It was the way a head of state might look at a smudge of grease on a silk tablecloth. An annoyance, something that marred the aesthetic of his perfection. He held court with a circle of international investors, men from Oslo and Stockholm who wore their wealth with a quiet, woolen heaviness. Julian was animated, his hand gestures sweeping and authoritative. He was performing. He was always performing. My sister, Sloane, stood beside him. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been glued back together one too many times. Her dress was a stunning shade of emerald, chosen specifically to bring out her eyes. But those eyes were darting around the room like trapped birds. She was smiling, but the smile did not reach the panic in her pupils. She was swallowing her fear like it was dry champagne, choking it down so as not to disturb the performance. Then, Julian turned his full attention to me. The conversation in his circle lulled, and he seized the silence. He wanted a show. He wanted to demonstrate his dominance, not just over the market, but over the people who had stumbled into his orbit by marriage. He spoke, but he did not speak in English. He switched seamlessly into a formal, antiquated dialect of Norwegian. It was a parlor trick he loved. He had spent a semester or two in Oslo, skiing and networking, and he collected languages the way other men collected watches, not to use them, but to flash them. "Melody," he said, his voice booming just loud enough to silence the nearby conversations. He used a tone that was unmistakably a command. "Look at you. You look like a housemaid who has lost her way." The investors around him chuckled. They were low, throaty sounds, the sound of men who knew who signed their checks. The Americans in the room, the ones who did not speak a word of a Scandinavian tongue, laughed too. They did not need to understand the syntax to understand the dynamic. They heard the condescension in his pitch, the sneer in his vowels. They knew I was being mocked, and in this social strata, when the king laughs, you laugh. You do not ask why. I stood perfectly still. The air conditioning in the Ravenwood Club was set to a chill 68 degrees, but I felt a different kind of cold spreading through my chest. It was the cold of absolute clarity. Julian saw my lack of reaction and mistook it for confusion. He thought I was the dumb American sister-in-law, the failure who lived in a shoebox apartment in Arlington, the one who worked obscure jobs and had no ambition. He thought the language was a wall he could stand behind, firing arrows that I could not see, let alone catch. He took a step closer. Emboldened by the laughter, he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Hent mer dricka till gästerna, du snäll, he continued, his voice dripping with faux politeness that was sharper than an insult. It is the only thing you are good for here. Sloane flinched. She understood enough context clues to know this was bad. Her hand reached out, hovering near his elbow, a silent plea for him to stop. He shook her off without even looking at her. He was enjoying himself too much. He was the alpha, culling the weak from the herd to entertain the lions. I did not move. I did not blink. I did not flush with embarrassment, though I knew that was what he wanted. He wanted to see the red creep up my neck. He wanted to see me stammer, to ask him what he meant, to look around helplessly for a translation. He wanted me small. He wanted me silent. He wanted me convenient. I let the silence stretch. I let it hang in the air until it became uncomfortable. The laughter died down, replaced by a curious tension. Why wasn't she moving? Why wasn't she scurrying away? Julian's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Before he hardened his jaw, he decided to twist the knife. He assumed I was too stupid to understand, so he felt safe to escalate. He turned back to the investors, specifically facing a silver-haired man I recognized as a heavy hitter from the Nordic markets. Julian spoke again, louder this time, delivering the punchline. Hun förstår ingenting, he said, gesturing to me with his glass. Her head is as empty as a piggy bank with no money, he grinned. A wide, predatory baring of teeth. He waited for the fresh wave of laughter. He waited for the validation of his power. I looked him dead in the eye. I did not use the tourist Norwegian he had likely picked up in the bars of Aker Brygge. I did not use the casual slang of the streets. I reached back into the archives of my mind, to the dusty shelves of the University of Bergen, where I had spent years of my life, years he knew nothing about because he had never bothered to ask. I reached for the language of the Hanseatic League, the precise, unforgiving grammar of old commercial law. My voice did not rise. It did not shake. It simply arrived, cutting through the humidity of his arrogance like a scalpel. It appears to be a grave miscalculation to confuse silence with ignorance. Mr. Voss, I said. My pronunciation was flawless, grounded in the dialect of the western fjords, stripped of any American accent. The room did not just go quiet, it went dead. The ambient noise of 200 people drinking and gossiping evaporated in a single heartbeat. I did not stop there. I saw the shock register in his eyes, a flicker of genuine, unadulterated panic, and I pressed the advantage. I shifted from general formality to the specific lexicon of liability and contract, the kind used when a business partnership is about to be dissolved due to a breach of faith. To use language as a weapon against those one assumes are defenseless is not only a breach of etiquette, but a breach of the code of honor under which these gentlemen operate. They invest in character, not in arrogance, I continued, holding his gaze until he was forced to blink. I gestured slightly to the Norwegian investors standing around him. The silence that followed was heavy, physical. It pressed against the eardrums. The laughter that had filled the space moments ago seemed like a distant memory from a different era. Julian froze. His hand, holding his glass of scotch, stopped halfway to his mouth. For the first time all evening, he looked unsure of his own limbs. He looked at the investors, then back at me, his brain struggling to recompute the data. The furniture had just spoken. The stain had just rewritten the rules of the engagement. The silver-haired investor, the one Julian had been trying so hard to impress, turned his gaze from Julian to me. His expression changed from polite amusement to sharp, assessing interest. He nodded at me, a microscopic dip of the chin that acknowledged the precision of my grammar and the weight of my rebuke. Sloane let out a breath she must have been holding for 10 minutes. Her eyes went wide, darting between me and her fiancé. Julian opened his mouth to speak, to salvage the moment, to spin it back into a joke. But nothing came out. The power had shifted. It had not been taken with a shout or a fight. It had been taken with a sentence. He stood there, in his $5,000 suit, in his room built for billionaires, and for the first time in his life, he looked entirely, utterly small. I took a slow sip of my water. It was cool and crisp. "Was there anything else you needed, Julian?" I asked, switching back to English, my tone mild, helpful, and utterly devastating. "Or shall I leave you to your business?" He said nothing. He couldn't. The room had forgotten how to breathe. And Julian Voss had forgotten his lines. My apartment in Arlington, Virginia, was 550 square feet of compromise. It sat on the third floor of a building that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and lemon floor cleaner, a scent that clung to my coats, no matter how many times I took them to the dry cleaner. I paid $1,600 a month for the privilege of living close enough to D.C. to see the glow of the city against the night sky, but far enough away to know I did not truly belong to it. The rent was paid by words. Specifically, it was paid by the dry, dusty, unglamorous words I churned out for the Marrowline Language Bureau. I was a contract translator, a ghost in the machine of international bureaucracy. I did not translate poetry or sweeping novels. I translated technical manuals for hydraulic pumps, liability waivers for shipping containers, and endless mind-numbing terms of service agreements. They paid me 18 cents a word, and I was grateful for every single penny. It was quiet work. It was safe work. It was work that required me to disappear into the text, to be nothing more than a conduit for someone else's meaning. That suited me just fine. In my family, being a conduit was the safest thing you could be. My living room was dominated not by a television, but by 3 tall, mismatched bookshelves I had dragged in from a curbside sale 2 years ago. Most people my age filled their shelves with paperbacks they bought at the airport or self-help books they never opened. My shelves told a different story, a story I kept hidden from the people who thought they knew me. They were heavy with the weight of the North. There were cracked spines of Old Norse grammar guides, thick volumes of Hanseatic trade laws, and photocopied binders of maritime court records from the 17th century. The margins were filled with my handwriting, graphite notes scribbled in a fever of intellectual discovery that felt like a lifetime ago. I ran my finger along the spine of a book titled Jurisdiction and Honor in the Medieval Fjord. It was a dry title for a book that contained so much fire. I had lived inside these books once, 3 years ago. I was not Melody Powell, the invisible sister in the Arlington Efficiency. I was Melody Powell, a doctoral candidate at the University of Bergen in Norway. I walked through streets slick with rain and history. I drank bitter coffee in cafes where fishermen sat next to philosophers. I was on the verge of securing a research grant worth $40,000, a grant that would have allowed me to publish my thesis on the linguistic manipulation in ancient trade disputes. I was going to be someone, not a billionaire's wife, not a socialite, but a scholar, someone who owned her own mind. Then came the phone call. Then came the guilt. Then came the sudden, unexplained family emergency that required me to drop everything and fly home. I left my books in boxes. I left my apartment overlooking the harbor. I left the only version of myself I actually liked. I came back to Virginia because my mother said I had to, because Sloan needed me, because that is what the Powells did. We circled the wagons, and since I was the one with the least to lose, I was the one expected to do the folding. My phone buzzed on the scratched coffee table, snapping me back to the gray reality of Arlington. It was my mother, Lorraine Powell. I stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds before answering. I needed to compose my voice. I needed to flatten it, to remove any edges that might snag on her nerves. "Hi, Mom," I said. "Melody," her voice clipped through the speaker, tight and high. It was her manager voice, the tone she used when she was orchestrating the family image. "Tell me you are not wearing the red dress." I looked down at my lap. I was wearing sweatpants. The red dress was hanging in the closet, still in its plastic bag. I had bought it on sale for $80, thinking maybe, just for once, I could look like I had blood in my veins. "I'm not wearing the red dress," I said. "Good." she exhaled, a sound of pure relief. Wear the beige silk, the one with the high neck. It's elegant. It's quiet. We don't need you drawing focus tonight. Melody, tonight is about Sloane. It is about the engagement. It is about the Voss family seeing us as cohesive. Cohesive, that was Mom's code word for compliant. I know, Mom, I said, walking over to the window. The traffic on I-395 was a river of red taillights. I'll be there on time. And Melody, she added, her voice dropping an octave, becoming serious. Please, keep the conversation light. If someone asks what you do, just say you work in communications. Don't start talking about dead languages or Viking lawsuits or whatever it is that makes people's eyes glaze over. Julian's friends are serious people. They don't want a lecture. I know the drill, I said. Smile, nod, be vague. I just want tonight to be perfect for your sister, she said, and the manipulation was so subtle it was almost art. She pivoted from criticism to maternal concern in a heartbeat. She's so nervous. You know how she gets. She needs you to be her rock. She needs you to be steady. I'll be steady, I promised. Good. See you at 7. Do not be late. Julian hates lateness. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and felt the familiar heavy exhaustion settle in my chest. It wasn't the tiredness of work. It was the fatigue of performance. I was an actor who had been playing the role of supporting character number 1 for 3 decades, and I was tired of the script. I walked into the bathroom to start the transformation. I showered, scrubbing away the smell of the apartment. I dried my hair and pulled it back into a low, severe bun. It was a hairstyle that said, librarian, not threat. I applied makeup with a light hand, enough to look polished, not enough to look striking. I put on the beige silk dress. My mother was right. It was elegant. It was also entirely forgettable. It was the color of unbleached paper, the color of dry sand. It washed me out, blending with my pale skin until I looked like a ghost of a woman. I stood before the full-length mirror attached to the back of the bathroom door. I studied the reflection. I was not ugly. My features were symmetrical. My eyes a dark, intelligent gray. But I had learned to hold my face in a way that discouraged interest. I slumped my shoulders just a fraction of an inch. I kept my chin down. I dimmed the light in my eyes. It was a survival mechanism. In a room with Julian Voss and my mother, visibility was a liability. If they didn't see you, they couldn't criticize you. If they didn't see you, they couldn't use you, or so I thought. I went back to the living room to grab my purse. My clutch was a vintage piece I had found at a thrift store for $12. It looked expensive if you didn't look too closely at the clasp. Just as I reached for the doorknob, my phone buzzed again. I assumed it was my mother, checking to make sure I had left. Or perhaps Sloane. Sending a panic-induced emoji, I picked it up. The number was not saved in my contacts. It was a local DC area code, but the digits were unfamiliar. I opened the message. Don't be near Julian when he talks business. I stared at the words. There was no signature, no context, just 8 words glowing on the screen. My thumb hovered over the delete button. It was probably a wrong number, or maybe spam, but then, a cold sensation started at the base of my neck and trickled down my spine. Ice water in my veins. It was the same feeling I had felt 3 years ago in Bergen, the day before everything fell apart. The day I came home to find my apartment door unlocked and a single file folder moved on my desk. I had convinced myself then that I was paranoid, that the stress of the thesis was getting to me. I had ignored the gut instinct that screamed, run. I read the text again. Sloane's warning echoed in my head. Who sent this? Was it someone who knew Julian? Someone who knew me? Julian, when he talks business. The phrasing was specific. It implied danger. It implied that Julian Voss, the golden boy of Washington philanthropy, the man who was about to marry my sister, was something else entirely when the cameras were off. I felt a sudden urge to stay home, to lock the deadbolt, curl up on my couch with my grammar books, and turn off my phone. Why was I walking into the lion's den? Why was I putting on this beige armor to go protect a sister who wouldn't stand up for herself, let alone for me? I looked around my apartment, the peeling paint in the corner, the stack of bills on the counter, the silence. If I stayed, I was safe, but if I stayed, Sloane was alone. I remembered Sloane's face the last time I saw her. It wasn't the face of a bride in love. It was the face of a hostage negotiating her own ransom. She had grabbed my hand, her fingers digging into my skin, and whispered, "Just be there, Mel, please. I can't do the dinner alone with his parents." Our family felt less like a circle of love and more like a limited liability corporation, where I was the silent partner with all the risk and none of the equity. But she was my sister. We had shared a room for 18 years. We had survived our mother's relentless ambition together. I couldn't leave her there. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the dusty apartment one last time. I slipped the phone into my clutch. I did not delete the message. I looked at myself in the mirror by the door. "You are invisible," I whispered to the reflection. "You are beige. You are the wall." But as I turned the lock and stepped out into the hallway, the memory of the text burned in my mind. The warning wasn't just about safety. It was an invitation to pay attention. They liked me because I was easy to ignore. They liked me because they thought I wasn't listening. Tonight, I decided, walking down the 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again, I would listen harder than I had ever listened in my life. I would be the wall. Yes, but walls have ears, and sometimes, if you lean close enough, you can hear the foundation cracking before the house actually falls. I pushed open the heavy front door of the building and stepped out into the cool Virginia evening. An Uber was waiting for me, a gray sedan that blended perfectly into the pavement. "Ravenwood Club," the driver said without looking back. "Yes," I replied. "Ravenwood Club?" The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the traffic that flowed toward the seat of power. I watched the city lights blur past, clutching my purse, the warning message sitting inside it like a loaded gun I didn't know how to use yet. I didn't know it then, but the Melody Powell who left the apartment that night would never come back to it. The woman coming home would be someone else entirely, someone who remembered that before she was a sister, and before she was a disappointment. She was a scholar of the laws that governed war. The Ravenwood Club did not have a sign. It did not have a website. It did not have a valet stand with a branded umbrella out front. It sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in Georgetown, disguised as just another historic federal-style mansion with brick walls that had stood since the War of 1812. The only way you knew it was there was if you belonged there. If you had to ask for the address, you were already trespassing. My Uber driver, a kind man who had tried to talk to me about the weather for the entire 20-minute ride, hesitated as we pulled up to the curb. He looked at the black iron gates and the expansive darkness of the lawn beyond them. "Is this it?" he asked, squinting at the GPS. "It looks like a private residence." "It is private," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt, "but not a residence." I thanked him and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air here was different. It smelled of old money, which is to say, it smelled of nothing at all. The exhaust fumes and the humidity of the city seemed to stop at the property line, repelled by an invisible force field of exclusivity. I walked toward the gate. 2 men in black suits stood there. They were not the kind of bouncers you see at nightclubs with earpieces and bulging necks. These men looked like Secret Service agents who had gone into the private sector for triple the salary. They were lean, sharp, and utterly humorless. A couple ahead of me, a silver-haired man in a tuxedo and a woman dripping in sapphires, breezed past the guards with a nod. They were waved through without a pause, without a check, without a second glance. They belonged. Their faces were their tickets. I stepped forward. One of the men stepped into my path. He did not touch me, but his presence was a physical wall. "Name," he said. He did not ask. He demanded. "Melody Powell," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I am here for the Voss engagement party." He looked at me. He looked at my beige dress. He looked at my vintage clutch. Then he looked down at the tablet in his hand. He scrolled. He scrolled slowly, deliberately taking his time. It was a power move, a way of letting me know that my existence was not a priority. "Powell," he muttered. He tapped the screen. "ID." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. The couple before me had not shown ID. "It is a private party," I said, reaching into my bag. "I am the bride's sister." He took my driver's license and held it up to the light, comparing the photo to my face as if I might be an imposter trying to crash a party where the average net worth was $50 million. He took 30 seconds to verify a piece of plastic. Behind me, another car pulled up, and I could feel the impatience radiating from the people waiting to get in. Finally, he handed it back. "You're on the supplemental list," he said, his tone making it clear that the supplemental list was one step above the catering staff. "Proceed." As I walked past him, I heard him lean slightly toward his partner. He didn't whisper quietly enough, or perhaps he wanted me to hear. "That's the sister," he murmured. The other one. Not the beautiful one, not the lucky one, not the one marrying a Voss. Just the other one, the spare part. The biological necessity who had to be invited to maintain the illusion of a happy family. I kept walking. I stared straight ahead at the massive oak doors of the mansion, forcing my spine to stay straight. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was an academic, a woman of substance, and that the opinions of a hired gatekeeper meant nothing. But the words stung. They found the old wounds, the ones that had never really healed since childhood, and pressed salt into them. The interior of the Ravenwood Club was designed to make you feel small. The ceilings were 20 feet high, adorned with plaster moldings that were likely carved by artisans who had been dead for 2 centuries. The floors were marble, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead. There was no music yet, just the low hum of conversation that sounded like the ocean inside a seashell. Waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, gliding like ghosts. I took a glass, not because I wanted it, but because holding it made me look like I was doing something other than standing alone. I scanned the room for a friendly face. I found none. What I found were the parents. Conrad Voss stood near the fireplace, a man carved out of granite and cold ambition. He was talking to a senator I recognized from the news, but Conrad looked like the one in charge. He didn't gesture. He just stood there, absorbing the space around him. He was a man who crushed companies for sport and called it market correction. Beside him was Miranda Voss. If Conrad was the hammer, Miranda was the scalpel. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that cost more than my college tuition. Her hair was a helmet of perfect blonde highlights, and her posture was rigid. She was smiling at someone, but the smile didn't move her eyes. She looked like a statue that had been taught to mimic human emotion, but hadn't quite mastered the warmth. I steered clear of them. I knew from the rehearsal dinner that Miranda viewed me as a genetic error that unfortunately shared DNA with her future daughter-in-law. I needed to find my seat. I needed a base of operations where I could sit down and disappear. I found the seating chart on an easel near the entrance to the ballroom. The names were written in elegant calligraphy. I scanned the head table. Julian, Sloane, Conrad, Miranda, my mother, the inner circle. I looked for my name at the tables nearby. Table 2, Table 3, nothing. I kept scanning. I went further down the list, past the business partners, past the distant cousins, past the college roommates. Finally, I found it. Melody Powell, Table 19. I looked into the ballroom to locate Table 19. It was in the far back corner. It was tucked behind a large decorative pillar and positioned directly next to the swinging double doors of the service corridor. I walked over to it. The table was set for 8, but it was currently empty. As I pulled out my chair, a waiter burst through the service doors with a tray of appetizers, the rush of air blowing a loose strand of hair across my face, the noise from the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, the shouting of chefs, was audible every time the doors opened. It was not an accident. In the language of high society, Seating charts were not logistical. They were political. Placing the bride's sister next to the kitchen was a statement. It said, "You are here for optics, but do not mistake yourself for a guest. You are functionally invisible. Stay out of the way." I sat down. I placed my clutch on the tablecloth. I took a sip of the champagne. It was dry and tasted like metal. "Just get through it," I whispered to myself. 3 hours, dinner, speeches, cake, then you can go home and never see these people again. But the text message in my purse felt heavy. "Don't be near Julian when he talks business." The room suddenly shifted. The energy changed. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. Sloane had arrived. She stood at the top of the short staircase leading into the ballroom. She was breathtaking. The emerald dress clung to her frame, shimmering under the lights. Her hair was swept up, revealing the long, elegant line of her neck. She looked like every inch the future Mrs. Julian Voss. But I knew my sister. I knew the way she held her jaw when she was trying not to scream. From across the room, even at table 19, I could see the tension in her shoulders. They were drawn up tight, as if she were bracing for a blow. Her smile was plastered on, a rigid mask of joy that didn't reach her eyes. Her chest was rising and falling too quickly. Shallow breaths, panic breaths. She was scanning the room, her eyes darting frantically. When she saw me in the corner, a flicker of relief crossed her face, followed immediately by a look of sorrow when she realized where I had been seated. She made a tiny motion, a half step toward me, but then she stopped, because Julian had entered, if the room had quieted for Sloane. It went silent for Julian. He didn't just walk into a room, he annexed it. He strode in through the main archway, flanked by 2 men who looked like lawyers. Julian was 34, handsome in a way that felt manufactured. Perfect teeth, perfect tan, hair that never moved. He wore his tuxedo like a suit of armor. The conversation in the room died instantly. It wasn't out of respect. I had studied power dynamics for years, both in history books and in corporate structures. Respect is warm. This silence was cold. It was the silence of a herd when the predator appears. It was the silence of submission. Julian stopped at the top of the stairs. He surveyed the room. He didn't smile warmly. He smiled benevolently, like a feudal lord surveying his serfs. He knew everyone in this room wanted something from him: money, access, approval. He held the keys to the kingdom, and he loved dangling them just out of reach. He walked down the stairs, and the room seemed to tilt toward him. People turned their bodies to face him. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands, clapping men on the shoulder, kissing the cheeks of women. But it was all performance. I watched him closely. He never looked anyone in the eye for more than 2 seconds. He was constantly scanning, looking over their shoulders for the next most important person. He made people feel small. I saw it happen in real time. A man, older than Julian, perhaps a banker, leaned in to say something. Julian laughed, a loud barking sound, and patted the man on the cheek. It was patronizing. It was a gesture you would use on a child or a dog. The banker smiled gratefully, thanking Julian for the humiliation because it meant Julian had noticed him. Then, Julian saw me. He was halfway across the room, moving toward the head table. His eyes swept over the crowd and snagged on the corner where I sat in exile. He stopped. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. He just looked. It was a look of cold, calculated appraisal. He looked at me the way an estate liquidator looks at a piece of furniture that is slightly damaged but might fetch a few dollars at auction. He was cataloging me: beige dress, corner table, alone, harmless. He smirked. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch of the lips. It was a smirk of satisfaction. He had put me in the corner, and I had stayed there. I was obeying the rules of his world. I was the other one, and I was acting the part perfectly. He turned away, dismissing me from his mind as if I were a completed checklist item. He reached Sloane, and instead of kissing her, he placed a hand on the back of her neck. It looked intimate to the casual observer, but I saw his fingers tighten. I saw the way he steered her, physically moving her to the left, so she would be in the better light for the photographer who had just appeared. He was positioning her. He was posing her. She wasn't his partner. She was his prop. I gripped the stem of my champagne glass so hard I thought it might snap. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Don't be notable. Don't be trouble. But my body was rebelling. My heart was hammering against my ribs. A primal drumbeat of warning, the text message, the seating chart, the look in Julian's eyes, the terror in Sloane's posture. It was all converging into a single, undeniable truth. This wasn't a celebration. This was a coronation, and we were the tribute. I looked at the service doors next to me. I could leave. I could stand up, walk through those swinging doors, exit through the kitchen, and take an Uber back to my safe. Quiet life of dead languages and dusty books. I could let Sloane marry this monster. I could let the Voss family swallow us whole. I watched Julian whisper something in Sloane's ear. She flinched. I set the glass down on the table with a soft clink. I wasn't going anywhere. Enjoy your victory lap, Julian, I thought, the words forming in my mind with the precision of the legal texts I translated. Because you have made one critical error. He thought the distance between the head table and the service corner made him safe. He thought I was too far away to matter. He didn't know that I had spent the last 3 years studying the acoustics of power. He didn't know that from the corner. You can see the angles that the people in the center miss, and he certainly didn't know that the furniture was about to start taking notes. I pulled my phone from my clutch and set it face down on the table. The camera lens pointing toward the center of the room, just in case. The air in the room was getting thinner, sucked up by the ego in the center. I took a deep breath, preparing for the suffocation. The night had barely begun, and I already knew that by the end of it, one of us, either Julian or me, would be left standing in the ruins of this polite society, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't planning on being the one who collapsed. The dinner service had not yet begun when Julian Voss materialized at my table in the corner. He did not approach like a host greeting a guest. He approached like a manager checking on an underperforming employee. The noise of the room seemed to bend around him, a gravitational pull that sucked the air out of my lungs. He stopped 2 feet from my chair. He did not sit. He loomed. "Melody," he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and devoid of any actual warmth. It was the voice of a man who had been trained to deliver bad news as if it were a gift. "Sloane is looking a bit pale. I think the heat of the room is getting to her." I looked up at him. "There are waiters everywhere. Julian, I am sure one of them can get her some water." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes changed. They went flat. It was a microscopic shift, a hardening of the iris that I would have missed if I hadn't been studying him so closely. "I don't trust the staff to get it to her quickly enough," he said. "And besides, she responds better to family. Be a darling and fetch her a sparkling water with a twist of lime. Bring it to the head table." It wasn't a request. It was a test. He was checking to see if the dog still knew how to fetch. He was establishing the hierarchy in front of the nearby tables. I was not the sister-in-law. I was the help. Before I could respond, before I could point out the absurdity of asking a guest to tend bar, my mother appeared at my elbow. She must have been watching us like a hawk, terrified that I would breathe incorrectly and shatter the evening. "Of course she will," my mother said, her voice breathless and tight. She dug her fingers into my shoulder, a pinch that was meant to be affectionate, but felt like a warning shot. "Go on, Melody. Sloane needs you. Don't just sit there. Help your sister." I looked at my mother. Her eyes were wide, pleading, "Do not make a scene." Her eyes screamed, "Just do as he says." I looked back at Julian. He was watching the interaction with a look of mild amusement, like a scientist observing rats in a maze. He knew he had my mother on a leash, and by extension, he thought he had me. "Fine," I said, standing up. "Sparkling water, lime." "Thank you, Melody," Julian said, dismissing me by turning his back before I had even finished standing. "Make sure it is cold." I walked toward the bar. my heels clicking on the marble floor. The humiliation burned in my chest, hot and acidic. I wasn't angry that I had to get water. I was angry that my mother had offered me up as a sacrifice to his ego without a second thought. To her, my dignity was a small price to pay for Julian's approval. The main bar was crowded, so I slipped into the service corridor that ran parallel to the ballroom. It was a narrow hallway used by the staff to move unseen, lined with stacks of extra chairs and trays of half-eaten appetizers. I was about to push through the door to the service bar when I heard voices. 2 waiters were standing near the ice machine, their backs to me. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "I am telling you, stay away from table 1, the taller waiter whispered. He sounded young, maybe 22. "I saw him fire Marcus last week at the gala, just snapped his fingers and had security drag him out." "What did Marcus do?" the other waiter asked. "He looked him in the eye," the first one said. "Julian asked for a refill, and Marcus looked him dead in the eye for like 3 seconds. Julian said it was insolent, said he didn't like being stared at by the help." "Jesus," the second waiter hissed. "The guy is a psychopath." "He is not a psychopath," the first one corrected. "He is a king, and kings kill people who forget to bow. Just keep your head down, drop the plate, and get out. Do not engage." I stood frozen in the shadows of the hallway. The air conditioner hummed above me, but I felt a sheen of sweat on my forehead. He fired someone for eye contact. It wasn't just arrogance, it was pathology. Julian Voss needed total submission. He needed to be the sun, and everyone else had to be blind or looking at the floor. And this was the man my sister was going to marry in 6 weeks. I grabbed a bottle of sparkling water from a service crate and a lime from a garnish tray. My hands were shaking slightly. I forced them to stop. I didn't go back to the head table. I scanned the room and saw Sloane slipping away from the crowd, heading toward the ladies' lounge. Her posture was all wrong. She wasn't walking. She was fleeing. I followed her. The restrooms at the Ravenwood Club were more luxurious than my entire apartment. The walls were covered in silk wallpaper, and the sinks were gold-plated. Sloane was standing in front of the mirror, gripping the edge of the marble counter so hard her knuckles were white. She wasn't crying. Crying would have been a release. She was hyperventilating, short, shallow gasps that she was trying to suppress. Her perfect face looked cracked. The makeup was flawless, but the woman underneath it looked like she had been awake for 100 years. "Sloane," I said softly. She jumped, spinning around. Her eyes were wide, feral. When she saw it was me, she collapsed slightly against the counter, but the tension didn't leave her shoulders. "Melody," she breathed. "You scared me." "Here," I said, handing her the water. "Julian ordered it for you, said you looked pale." She took the bottle, staring at it as if it were a foreign object. "He is so thoughtful," she whispered. It sounded like a line she had memorized. "He always notices when I am not perfect. He notices when you are not performing," I corrected. I stepped closer. The room was empty except for us. "Sloane, look at me. Drop the act. It is just us." She looked up. Her eyes were glassy. "I don't know what you mean." "I heard the staff talking," I said, keeping my voice low. "They are terrified of him. He fires people for looking at him. He treats Mom like a servant. He treats me like furniture. And he treats you like a doll he can pose." "Stop it," she said, turning back to the mirror and aggressively smoothing her dress. "I won't stop," I said. "He doesn't love you. Sloane, love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't make you afraid to breathe. This isn't a marriage. It is a merger. And you are the asset being acquired." Sloane froze. She stared at her reflection, and for a second, I saw the sister I grew up with. The girl who used to laugh so hard, milk came out of her nose. The girl who wanted to be a veterinarian. That girl was screaming behind the eyes of this terrified woman, but then, the training kicked in. It was horrifying to watch. Her face smoothed out. The panic was shoved down into a box, locked tight. She turned to me, and her expression was cold, defensive. You are jealous, she spat. The accusation hit me like a slap. What? You are jealous, she repeated, her voice rising. You have always been the smart one, the serious one. But I am the one who got the billionaire. I am the one who is going to live in a mansion and travel the world. And you are stuck in Arlington translating instruction manuals. You can't stand that I won. Won? I asked, incredulous. Sloane, look at your hands. You are shaking. Is this what winning feels like? It is just nerves, she shouted. It is a big night. Why can't you just be happy for me? Why do you have to ruin everything with your gloom? Julian loves me. He takes care of me. He takes care of this family. She pushed past me, shoulder-checking me as she stormed out of the restroom. The door swung shut, leaving me alone in the silence of the gold-plated cage. She was gone. She wasn't just in denial. She was complicit. She had bought into the narrative because the alternative was too terrifying to face. I walked out of the restroom, feeling heavy. I needed air. I needed to leave, but I couldn't leave without my mother. I found Mom in a small alcove near the coat check. She was digging through her purse, her movements frantic. She looked like a woman on the verge of a breakdown. Mom, I said, stepping into the alcove. She jumped, dropping a tube of lipstick. Melody, where is your sister? Is she okay? Did she drink the water? She is back in the ballroom, I said. She is performing, just like you taught her. Don't start with me, Mom hissed, crouching down to pick up the lipstick. Not tonight. Why, Mom? I asked. I didn't help her pick it up. Why the rush? Why are you pushing this so hard? Sloane is 24. She barely knows him. He is a monster. I can see it. You can see it. He is a Voss. Mom stood up. Her face flushed. Do you know what that means? It means security. It means safety. It means control, I countered. We are not destitute. Mom, Dad left us enough. We don't need to sell Sloane to survive. Mom looked away. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She started fiddling with the clasp of her purse again, her fingers trembling. You don't understand, Melody. Things are complicated. The economy, the investments. What investments? I stepped closer. Dad's trust was in government bonds. It is rock solid. It wasn't enough, Mom snapped, and then she covered her mouth, realizing she had yelled. She lowered her voice to a whisper. It wasn't enough. I wanted to maintain the house, the club memberships. Appearances matter. Melody, they matter. So you borrowed money? I asked, feeling a pit form in my stomach. From whom? The banks wouldn't. I had a cash flow problem, she stammered. But the Voss family, Conrad, he stepped in. He helped us. He consolidated everything. It was a gesture of goodwill. Goodwill, I repeated. How much, Mom? It doesn't matter, she said, trying to push past me. It is handled. Once the wedding happens, the debt is forgiven. It is part of the dowry agreement. It is a gift. Let me see, I said. See what? The agreement. You have it, don't you? You are clutching that phone like it is a life raft. Melody, stop. I reached out and grabbed her wrist. It wasn't gentle, but I was desperate. I saw the screen of her phone. It was open to a PDF document attached to an email. The subject line read, Final Consolidation Guarantor Terms, Voss Holdings. Let me see, I demanded, and I took the phone from her unresisting hand. Melody, don't read it, Mom sobbed quietly. Please. I zoomed in on the document. It was a loan agreement, a massive one, $400,000. But that wasn't what made the blood drain from my face. I scrolled to the bottom, to the signature page. There was my mother's signature. There was a space for Sloane's, and there, below them, was a line for a secondary guarantor. The name typed underneath was Melody Ann Powell, and next to it was a signature, my signature. I stared at the loop of the M, the sharp cross of the T. It looked exactly like my handwriting. It was a perfect forgery. "I never signed this," I whispered. My voice sounded far away. Mom was crying now. Silent. Ugly tears. "They said they needed a second guarantor for the underwriting. Because of your potential inheritance. They said it was just a formality. They said they would handle the paperwork." "They forged my signature?" I looked at her, horror dawning on me. "And you knew?" "I didn't know until afterwards," she pleaded. "Julian said it was easier this way. He said he didn't want to bother you with the legal jargon. He said it was just to keep the lawyers happy." I looked back at the document. I read the clause above the signatures. In the event of default or dissolution of the prenuptial agreement prior to the vesting date, 5 years post-marriage, the guarantors become immediately and jointly liable for the full principal plus accrued interest at 18%. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a hostage situation. If Sloane didn't marry him, we owed them $400,000 immediately. If Sloane married him and tried to leave before 5 years, we owed them $400,000. And because my name was on it, they could come after me. They could garnish my wages. They could seize my future assets. They could destroy my credit. They had bound me to this ship without me ever stepping foot on the deck. "They own us," I said. The realization was absolute. They didn't just buy Sloane. They bought the whole family to make sure she couldn't run. "It will be fine," Mom whimpered, wiping her eyes. "Just let her marry him. The debt goes away. It is forgiven. We just have to get through the wedding." I looked at my mother. I saw a woman who had traded her daughter's freedom for a country club membership and a house she couldn't afford. I felt a surge of pity, but it was quickly drowned out by a cold, sharp rage. They thought they had won. They thought they had tied the knot so tight we would never breathe again. Julian Voss thought he was the master of the universe, moving pieces on a board, forging signatures, buying lives. He thought I was the other one, the quiet one, the one who fetched water. I handed the phone back to my mother. My hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. "Wipe your face, Mom," I said. My voice was different. It was lower, harder. "Go back inside. Sit at the head table. Smile at Conrad Voss." "Where are you going?" she asked, terrified. "Melody, please don't cause a scene." "I am not going to cause a scene," I said. "I am going to finish the game." I turned and walked away from her. I didn't go to the exit. I walked back toward the ballroom. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. The desire to be invisible was gone. Julian Voss had used the language of finance and fraud to trap me. He had used the language of intimidation to silence my sister. He thought those were the only languages that mattered. He didn't know that I spoke other languages, older languages that had been used to settle blood feuds and dismantle tyrants long before his family made their first million. I walked through the double doors, back into the glittering room. The light seemed brighter now. The noise was sharper. I saw Julian at the head table, laughing, holding court. He looked comfortable. He looked safe. I adjusted the strap of my clutch. I smoothed the skirt of my beige dress. "You want to play with contracts, Julian?" I thought, my eyes locking onto his profile across the room. "You want to play with liability? Let's see how you handle the law of retribution." I walked to my table in the corner, sat down, and waited. I wasn't waiting for the cake. I was waiting for the moment he decided to speak again, because the next time he opened his mouth to humiliate us, I wasn't going to translate it. I was going to prosecute it. The waiter had cleared the appetizer plates, leaving behind a few crumbs of bruschetta and the lingering scent of truffle oil. My corner table remained an island of isolation. I watched the room with a new lens, the camera of my mind recording every handshake, every forced smile, every shifting glance. I was no longer just the sister. I was a witness building a case, but witnesses need evidence, and evidence is rarely found in the spotlight. It is found in the shadows, in the margins, in the places where people think no one is watching. I stood up. I needed to move. The air at table 19 was stagnant. heavy with the smell of the kitchen exhaust. I smoothed the skirt of my beige dress, grabbed my clutch, and slipped toward the service corridor again. This time, I didn't go in search of water. I went in search of the truth. The corridor was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the crystal brilliance of the ballroom. It smelled of industrial dishwasher detergent and roasted beef. I walked softly, my heels making no sound on the rubberized floor mats designed for staff safety. I heard his voice before I saw him. Julian Voss was standing in a small alcove near the emergency exit, his back to the corridor. He was pacing, a tight, caged animal movement that betrayed the calm facade he had worn in the ballroom. He had a phone pressed to his ear, and his hand was chopping the air aggressively. "I do not care about the regulatory delay," Julian hissed. His voice was low, but the acoustics of the concrete hallway carried every syllable. "You tell them the liquidity is there. Tell them Voss Holdings is guaranteeing the bridge loan personally." He paused, listening to the person on the other end. I pressed myself flat against the wall, behind a stack of banquet chairs. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Listen to me," Julian snapped, his voice rising in pitch. "This isn't just a portfolio expansion. This is the cornerstone of the quarter. We are talking about $250 million in Nordic assets. If we do not close tonight, the whole structure looks weak. I need Falk to sign. I need him to trust the valuation. $250 million. The number hung in the damp air of the hallway. It was a staggering sum, even for people like the Voss family. But it was the desperation in his tone that caught my attention. Billionaires do not typically sound this frantic over $250 million unless they don't actually have it, or unless they have already spent it before they earned it. "Falk is in the room," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He is watching me like a hawk. I am putting on the show. I am speaking the language. I am charming the board. But I need the papers ready. When I give the signal, you send the digital packet. Do not fail me on this, or you will be practicing law in a strip mall in Delaware." He hung up the phone with a violent stab of his finger. He stood there for a moment, adjusting his cufflinks, taking deep, centering breaths. He rolled his neck, cracking the tension out of his spine, and then rearranged his face. The predator mask slid back into place. The desperation vanished, replaced by the smooth, untouchable veneer of the golden boy. He pushed through the doors back into the ballroom, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and fear in his wake. I waited 10 seconds, counting them out in my head. 1, 2, 3. I followed him, back in the ballroom. The atmosphere had shifted slightly. The dinner service was beginning. Waiters were pouring red wine, but my eyes were not on the food. They were searching for the man Julian had named, Soren Falk. I scanned the room, filtering out the faces I knew, the senators, the lobbyists, the socialites. I looked for the anomaly, and there he was. He was seated at table 1, the table of honor, directly across from where Julian had just taken his seat. He was the silver-haired man I had noticed earlier, the one Julian had tried to impress with his Norwegian insults. Soren Falk was a study in contrast to the American excess around him. While the men at the neighboring tables wore watches the size of hockey pucks and laughed too loudly at their own jokes, Soren sat in stillness. He wore a tuxedo that was impeccably tailored but understated. No flashy lapel pins, no diamond studs. His hair was a shock of white, combed back from a face that looked like it had been carved from driftwood, lined, weathered, and intelligent. He was not eating. He was holding a glass of wine. But he wasn't drinking it. He was watching Julian. I recognized the name now. Soren Falk, chairman of the Falk-Hansen Sovereign Fund. He was a legend in the Nordic business world, a man who managed pension funds and government assets with a moral compass that was famously rigid. He didn't just invest in companies. He invested in stability. He invested in truth. And Julian Voss was trying to sell him a lie worth $250 million. I walked back to my table in the corner, my mind racing. The pieces were clicking together. The rush to marry Sloane, the consolidation of my mother's debts, the forged signature on the guarantor agreement. Julian was leveraging everything: his marriage, his family's reputation, my mother's assets. To secure this deal, he needed to look like a stable family man with deep roots and liquid capital to satisfy Soren Falk's due diligence. We weren't just props for a wedding. We were collateral for a business merger. I sat down at table 19. The waiter had placed a salad in front of me. I picked up my fork, but my hand paused. A woman was standing next to my table. She didn't look like a guest. She wore a black pantsuit that was sharp enough to cut glass, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail. She held a file folder against her chest. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the room, scanning the perimeter like a security guard. But when she spoke to me. "He does not like loose ends," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, pitched so low that the clatter of silverware at the next table drowned it out for everyone but me. I looked up. "Excuse me?" She turned her head slightly. I recognized her. Dana Mercer. She was a lawyer who operated in the orbit of the Voss family. Not their direct counsel, but part of the ecosystem. I had seen her name on the CC line of a few emails my mother had forwarded me regarding the venue contracts. "Julian," she said, her lips barely moving. "He saw you in the hallway earlier. He didn't say anything, but he saw you. He hates being outshined, Melody, and he hates being observed." "I was just getting water," I said, testing her. Dana offered a humorless smile. "You were listening, and tonight, listening is a dangerous hobby." She stepped closer, pretending to check the placement of the centerpiece on my table. "He will make an example of you," she murmured. "He needs to show Falk that he is dominant, that he controls his environment. You are the anomaly in his perfect picture. If you step out of line, he will crush you, and he has the legal team to make sure you stay crushed." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Dana paused. She looked at Julian across the room, and for a fleeting second, I saw something in her expression that looked like exhaustion, or perhaps it was disgust. "Because I read the guarantor agreement," she said. "The one with the signature that looks a little too perfect." My breath hitched. She knew. "Good luck, Melody," she said, straightening up. "Don't blink." And then she was gone, dissolving into the crowd of waiters and support staff, leaving me with a salad I couldn't eat and a warning I couldn't ignore. I looked back at table 1. Julian was laughing again, pouring wine for Soren Falk. He looked the picture of the benevolent host, but now I knew what was happening under the surface. It was a performance with a price tag of $250 million. Then, something shifted. Soren Falk wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking past him. He was looking at me. It wasn't the dismissive glance of the other guests. It wasn't the pitying look of my mother. It was a direct, unwavering gaze. He was studying me. He looked at my beige dress, my posture, the way I held my head, and then he nodded. It was tiny, a fraction of an inch, but it was there. A jolt of electricity ran through me. Then it hit me. Soren Falk wasn't just here to sign a deal. He wasn't just a passive investor waiting to be wooed. He was investigating. I thought about my work, my translations. The Marrowline Language Bureau was a contractor. Yes, but we often handled sensitive overflow work for international firms. 3 months ago, I had translated a massive dossier on ethical compliance in American family-owned conglomerates for a Nordic client. I had never known the client's name. It was blind work, but I remembered the style guide. I remembered the specific requests for terminology regarding nepotism and leveraged debt. Soren Falk knew who I was, or at least, he knew my work. He knew that someone in Washington, D.C., understood the nuances of his language better than his own lawyers. He was testing Julian. He was using the engagement party as a stress test. He wanted to see how Julian Voss behaved when he thought he was winning. He wanted to see the man behind the balance sheet. And Julian was failing. He was failing because he thought power was about dominance, about humiliating the weak. He didn't realize that for a man like Soren Falk, power was about restraint. I felt a sudden, fierce clarity. I wasn't just a victim in this room, I was a variable that Julian hadn't accounted for. Melody. The voice was ragged. I tore my eyes away from Soren and looked up. Sloane had returned. She stood by my chair, looking like she was holding herself together with scotch tape and prayer. Her face was pale, and her eyes were rimmed with red. Though she had clearly tried to fix her makeup, she gripped my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. "Please," she whispered. "Please, Melody, don't do anything." "Sloane," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He is using you. He is using Mom. He is using me. This isn't a wedding. It is a closing dinner for a bank loan." "I don't care," she hissed, a tear escaping and tracking through the powder on her cheek. "I don't care about the money. I just want it to be over. I just want peace. If you cause a scene, if you embarrass him, he will destroy us. You know he will. He has the lawyers. He has the debt. He owns us." "He only owns us if we sign the papers," I said. "They are already signed," she cried softly, looking terrified that someone might hear. "The guarantor agreement. Mom told me. It is done." "I didn't sign it," I said. "It doesn't matter." Sloane squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. "He says it is valid. He says if we fight him, he will sue Mom for fraud. He will put her in jail. Melody, do you understand? He threatened to put Mom in jail." I stared at my sister. The fear in her eyes was total. She had been beaten down, inch by inch, until she believed that submission was the only way to survive. She believed that silence was safety. "Don't say anything," she begged, her voice breaking. "Just sit here. Just eat the dinner. Let him have his night. Please. For me." I looked at her. I loved her. I had spent my whole life protecting her. I had given up my scholarship for her. I had moved back to Virginia for her. I had made myself small so she could feel big. And look where it had gotten us. My silence hadn't saved her. My silence had sold her. I looked at Julian, who was now standing up, tapping a spoon against his glass. The room was quieting down. He was preparing to make a speech. He was preparing to seal the deal, to lock the cage door, to finalize the transaction that traded my sister's life for a portfolio of assets. He looked confident. He looked invincible. I looked back at Sloane. "I love you, Sloane," I said. My voice was calm. It was the calm of a decision that has already been made. "And because I love you, I cannot do what you are asking." "Melody, no," she whispered. "Go back to your seat," I said gently. "And when the time comes, don't look at me. Look at him." "Melody!" "Go?" She stared at me for one last, desperate second, then turned and fled back to the head table. Wiping her face, Julian cleared his throat. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom. He smiled that shark-like smile. I picked up my phone. I checked the recording app. It was running. I picked up my glass of water. I took a sip. I thought about the books on my shelf in Arlington. I thought about the ancient laws of the North, the laws that demanded honor, the laws that punished those who used words to deceive. Julian Voss thought he was speaking Norwegian. He thought he was speaking the language of power. He was about to learn that he was speaking to a native speaker. I turned my chair slightly, angling my body toward the center of the room. I wasn't hiding in the corner anymore. I was taking the stand. The silence that I had kept for 3 years was about to end, and it was going to end loudly. The clinking of silverware against fine china subsided slowly, dying out like a retreating tide as Julian Voss tapped his spoon against the side of his crystal champagne flute. The sound was sharp, high-pitched, and demanding. It cut through the low hum of conversation, signaling that the master of the house intended to speak. I sat at table 19, my hands folded in my lap. I did not look at my phone. I did not look at the exit. I looked at him. Julian stood up. He adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo, a movement so practiced it looked choreographed. He beamed at the room, that wide, predatory smile that people mistook for charisma. He waited for the silence to become absolute, letting the tension build until every eye in the room was fixed on him. "My friends," Julian began, his voice booming without the aid of a microphone. "We have gathered here to celebrate love, yes, but we are also here to celebrate heritage, to celebrate the merging of worlds." He gestured vaguely toward the table where the Norwegian investors sat. Soren Falk did not smile. He simply watched, his face unreadable. "As many of you know," Julian continued, walking slowly around the head table, moving closer to the center of the room. "I spent several formative months in Oslo during my youth. It was there that I learned the value of stoicism, the value of precision, and, of course, the beauty of a language that speaks to the soul of commerce." He paused for effect. The guests nodded. They ate it up. They loved the idea of their American prince being a man of the world, a scholar as well as a shark. "But language," Julian said, his eyes suddenly snapping toward the corner of the room, locking onto me like a laser sight, "is also a tool for honesty, and tonight I feel a burden of honesty upon me." The room followed his gaze. 200 heads turned. I felt the weight of their attention physically. Like a sudden increase in gravity, I was the only person sitting at table 19. I was the beige spot in the corner. "My future sister-in-law, Melody," Julian said, saying my name as if it were a punchline. "She sits there so quietly. You might think she is shy. You might think she is demure." He chuckled. A low, rumbling sound. "But we know better, don't we?" He took a step toward me. He was playing to the crowd, but he was hunting me. "We need a little intellectual entertainment to digest this wonderful meal," he announced. "So, allow me to demonstrate something. I want to share a few sentiments with our friends from the North. Sentiments about family obligations." He turned his back to the main room, facing me directly, but pitching his voice so the Norwegians at table 1 could hear every syllable. He switched to Norwegian. It wasn't the choppy, hesitant Norwegian of a tourist. It was fluent, yes, but it was the fluency of a mimic. He had the vocabulary, but he lacked the soul. He spoke the standard East Norwegian dialect, the dialect of the capital, the dialect of power, but he exaggerated the intonations, making it sound theatrical. "Melody," he said in Norwegian, smiling broadly so the Americans would think he was paying me a compliment. "Are you sitting there counting the seconds until you can run home to your little hole?" A few of the Norwegian investors chuckled politely. They assumed it was a teasing, familial jab. I did not blink. I kept my face perfectly neutral. "She doesn't understand," Julian said to the room, switching briefly to English to keep the Americans involved. "She doesn't understand. It is a private dialect, a little game we play." He was lying. He knew I didn't speak his private dialect. He was counting on it. He wanted to paint a picture of intimacy that didn't exist, to frame his abuse as an inside joke. He switched back to Norwegian, and this time, the venom seeped in. "You are a disgrace to your sister," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "You are like a leech. You suck blood from the family because you are too weak to hunt for yourself." He laughed. He threw his head back and laughed, signaling to the room that this was funny. The Americans, clueless and eager to please, laughed with him. They saw his smile. They heard the cadence of a joke. They joined in the chorus. I saw Sloane at the head table. She was looking down at her plate, her hands gripping the tablecloth so hard her knuckles were white. She knew. She didn't speak the language, but she knew the tone. She knew what he was doing. He was stripping me naked in front of 200 people, and he was making them applaud the execution. "Look at her," Julian continued, gesturing to me with an open hand. "She has no ambition, no future, just a gray shadow hanging over us." He was enjoying it. He was high on it. This was his drug. Public dominance. He was showing Soren Falk that he could control the narrative, that he could insult a woman to her face and make her sit there and take it. He was showing them that he was the alpha. I remained motionless. I did not flush. I did not frown. I breathed in, deep and slow. I analyzed his grammar. I noted that he used the modern word for leech, rather than the more descriptive, archaic term used in maritime law for parasitic cargo. His pronunciation of the vowel Y in scam was slightly off, too American, too rounded. He was sloppy, he was arrogant, and he was walking right into the trap. Julian seemed annoyed by my lack of reaction. He wanted tears. He wanted me to look confused, to look at my mother for help. He wanted the satisfaction of seeing me break. He decided to escalate. He decided to deliver the killing blow. He walked closer, until he was standing just 10 feet away from my table. He looked at the Norwegian table, making eye contact with Soren Falk, ensuring the chairman was listening. "I gamle dager," Julian said, his voice dropping to a mock-serious register, adopting a pretentiously archaic tone. "In the old days, we would have put such women in the kitchen with the pigs, where they belong, under the boots of men who build the world." The room was quiet. The Americans didn't understand the words, but they felt the cruelty. The tone had shifted from teasing to something darker. Julian smiled at me, a cold, triumphant smile. He believed he had won. He believed he had just branded me as livestock in front of the people who mattered, using a language he thought was his secret weapon. He waited for me to look down. He waited for me to crumble. I stood up. I did not rush. I pushed my chair back slowly. The sound of the chair legs scraping against the marble floor was loud in the silence. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected me to stand. I looked him in the eye. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds, long enough for him to wonder, long enough for the doubt to creep in. And then, I spoke. I did not speak the Norwegian of the Oslo streets. I did not speak the Norwegian of the modern boardroom. I spoke the Norwegian of the Hanseatic contour. I spoke the language of the 13th century trade laws, the Gulatingsloven, the precise, heavy, ironclad language of commercial justice. My voice was lower than his, resonant and stripped of any American accent. I hit the consonants with the sharp precision of a hammer striking an anvil. Det står skrevet I Magnus Lagabötes. Landslov. I began, my voice carrying to the back of the room without effort. Er en man som bruker sin stilling til å tråkke på en frir kvinnes ære. Ikke er en høvding, men en needing. It is written in Magnus the lawmender's law of the land that a man who uses his station to trample on the honor of a free woman is not a chieftain, but a knighting. The word knighting, it hit the room like a physical blow. For the Americans, it meant nothing, but for the 7 people at the Norwegian table, it was a nuclear detonation. Knighting, it was an ancient legal term, the gravest insult in the Nordic code. It meant a man without honor, a social outcast, a coward who strikes from the shadows, a man so vile he is stripped of his legal rights. Julian's face went slack. The color drained from his skin so fast it looked like the blood had been siphoned out of him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I wasn't done. I took a step forward, moving out from behind table 19. I walked into the light. Furthermore, I continued, switching to the complex syntax of medieval contract disputes, the law of sales and purchase states that he who sells goods he does not own or promises away a future he has no right to shall be branded as a swindler and expelled from the marketplace. I looked directly at Soren Falk. Is this the man you wish to trade with? A man who believes that money gives him the right to rewrite the truth? Soren Falk slowly lowered his wineglass to the table. He did not look at Julian. He looked at me, and for the first time that night, his face broke into an expression. It was a look of profound, stunned recognition. He recognized the dialect. He recognized the citation. He recognized the authority. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was a vacuum. No one breathed. The Americans were looking back and forth between me and Julian, trying to decode the disaster that had just unfolded. They saw Julian's pale face. They saw my steady hand. They realized, with a dawning horror, that the furniture had just pulled a gun. Julian stood frozen. His brain was misfiring. He had spent months bragging about his linguistic prowess. And in 30 seconds, I had exposed him as a fraud. I hadn't just understood him. I had outflanked him using a vocabulary he didn't even know existed. "Melody," he croaked. He tried to switch back to English, tried to regain control of the room, but his voice cracked. "Do not speak to me of pigs. Julian," I said, switching seamlessly to English, my voice cold and hard as granite. "And do not speak to these men of honor. You have neither." I stood there, the center of the room, the center of the world. My mother had her hands over her mouth. Sloane was staring at me with wide, terrified, awestruck eyes. Julian looked around the room. He saw the doubt in the eyes of his investors. He saw the confusion in the eyes of his friends. He saw the structure of his night, the carefully curated image of the benevolent billionaire, collapsing into dust. He had lost the linguistic battle. He had lost the moral high ground. But Julian Voss was not a man who surrendered. He was a man who pivoted. I saw the change in his eyes. The shock faded, replaced by a desperate, rat-like cunning. He realized he couldn't win on the merits of the argument. He couldn't win on language. So he had to change the battlefield. He straightened his spine. He forced a laugh, a harsh, jagged sound that grated on the ears. "Well," Julian said, spreading his hands wide, addressing the room with a shake of his head, "I suppose I should have expected this." He turned to Conrad Voss. "I apologize, Father," Julian said, his voice gaining strength, shifting into the tone of a victim. "I didn't want to bring this up tonight. I tried to cover for her. I tried to make a joke of it to spare her feelings." He pointed a finger at me, a finger that was shaking, just slightly. "But it seems Melody has had too much to drink," he lied smoothly. "And when she drinks, she imagines things. She imagines she is a lawyer. She imagines she is relevant." He looked at the security guard standing by the door. "She has been listening at keyholes all night," Julian announced, his voice hardening. "I caught her earlier in the service corridor, spying on my private calls, trying to steal trade secrets to sell to the highest bidder." The room gasped. "Spying?" someone whispered. "Corporate espionage," Julian declared, grabbing the lifeline of a lie. "That is why she speaks the language. Ladies and gentlemen, not because she is a scholar, but because she has been trained to steal from us." He looked at me with pure hatred. "Plan B," I thought, watching him weave the noose. Gaslight the room, accuse the witness. I didn't move. I didn't defend myself. I just watched him dig, because Julian didn't know that while he was busy inventing a crime, I had already secured the evidence of the real one. "Security," Julian barked. "Escort her out, before she steals anything else." The silence that followed my accusation of knighting was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath before the scream. Julian Voss stood in the center of the room, stripped of his dignity by a language he had tried to weaponize. For a moment, he looked like a man standing in the ruins of his own ego. But I had underestimated the speed of his recovery. I had underestimated the sheer, kinetic force of his entitlement. Julian did not apologize. He did not retreat. He did not even blink. Instead, he did what men like him always do when the truth corners them. He burned the truth down and built a new reality from the ashes. He turned to the room, his face transforming from shock to a mask of grave, professional concern. He let out a sigh that sounded weary, the sigh of a benevolent leader forced to deal with an unruly child. "I am sorry," he said, his voice dropping to a register of deep regret. "I am so sorry you all had to witness this. I tried to protect her. I tried to keep this private." He turned his back on me, addressing the confused American guests and the stoic Norwegian investors. "You must understand," Julian said, pacing slowly, reclaiming the floor. "Melody is not just my fiancé's sister. She is a liability we have been managing for months, and tonight, I am afraid she has forced my hand." He pointed at me, not with anger, but with an accusatory pity. She speaks the language. Yes, Julian said, nodding as if conceding a point. But ask yourselves, why? Why would an obscure translator from Arlington know the intimate details of a trade deal I have not even announced to the press? Why would she be lurking in the service corridors, pressing her ear to the doors? The room rippled. The narrative was shifting. He was planting the seed of suspicion. I caught her, Julian lied, his voice gaining strength. 20 minutes ago, she was in the hallway, recording my private conversation with my legal counsel. She was trying to extract the valuation of the Nordic portfolio. That is a lie, I said. My voice was calm, but the air around me felt thin. Is it? Julian snapped, turning on me with the ferocity of a prosecutor. Then tell these good people, Melody, were you or were you not standing in the service corridor while I was on the phone with the board? Were you or were you not hiding behind the banquet chairs? I hesitated. I had been there. He had taken the truth, my physical location, and wrapped it in a lie about my intent. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. I was there because you sent me to get water, I said. Water? Julian scoffed, looking at the crowd. We have 20 waiters on staff tonight, and she says I sent the bride's sister to fetch a lime. The guests murmured. It sounded plausible. To them, the idea that a billionaire would send a guest to do manual labor was absurd, even though that is exactly what he had done. He relied on their assumption of his civility to cover his cruelty. This is corporate espionage, Julian declared, dropping the term like a gavel. She is not here to celebrate. She is here to sabotage. She is selling information to our competitors. That is why she learned the legal dialect. Not for scholarship, for theft. Conrad Voss stepped forward then, the patriarch. He moved with the weight of a battleship. I warned you, Julian, Conrad said, his voice booming. I told you there were leaks in this family. This is unacceptable behavior. We cannot have a spy in the Ravenwood Club. Miranda Voss joined the chorus, her face pinched with faux outrage. It is disgusting, she hissed, clutching her pearls. After everything we have done for her mother, after we paid off their debts, this is how she repays us? By trying to destroy the merger? Security, Conrad shouted. We need security here immediately. This woman needs to be detained and her phone confiscated. She has proprietary data on that device. The room was turning. I could feel it. The guests who had been looking at me with awe moments ago were now looking at me with fear. To the wealthy, a spy was worse than a murderer. A spy threatened their money. A spy threatened their secrets. I stood alone in the center of the ring. The accusations were coming from all sides. A barrage of noise designed to disorient me. Then, I felt a hand on my arm. It was my mother. She had rushed over from the head table, her face a mask of sheer panic. Her eyes were wide and wet, the makeup streaking down her cheeks. She gripped my bicep with painful force, her nails digging into my skin. Melody, she whispered, her voice trembling. Melody, stop it, please. Mom, he is lying, I said, looking down at her. You know he is lying. It does not matter, she hissed, shaking me. Don't you understand? It does not matter what is true. It matters what they can do to us. He just accused me of a felony. Mom, just apologize, she begged, the tears spilling over. Go to him. Say you were drunk. Say you were jealous. Say anything he wants you to say. We cannot lose this. Melody, the house, the loans, the reputation. If he walks away, we are destitute. We are finished. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me. In her eyes, I didn't see a mother protecting her child. I saw a debtor protecting her creditor. She was willing to let me be branded a criminal, a thief, and a liar, just to keep the checks clearing. You want me to confess to a crime I didn't commit, so you can keep your country club membership? I asked quietly. I want us to survive, she sobbed. Why do you always have to be so difficult? Why can't you just play the part? I pulled my arm away from her grip. It felt like breaking a bone. I am done playing parts. Mom? I looked past her to Sloane. My sister was standing by the head table. She was trembling so violently that the champagne in the glass near her hand was rippling. She looked at me, and then she looked at Julian. Julian was watching her, too. He raised an eyebrow, a silent command. Choose, his face said. Choose your future, the mansion or the sister. Sloane closed her eyes. She took a breath, and then she turned her head away. She looked at the wall. She looked at the floor. She looked anywhere but at me. It was a quiet betrayal, but it cut deeper than Julian's shouting. She chose safety. She chose the cage because she was too terrified of the wild. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, a numbness that was almost a relief. The family I had come to save didn't exist. There was only a ledger of debts and a hierarchy of fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian announced, seeing that he had isolated me completely. I did not want to do this. I truly didn't. But since Melody seems intent on denying her actions, I have to show you the proof. He snapped his fingers. A young man in a suit, one of his assistants, hurried forward from the shadows of the room. He handed Julian a blue folder. Julian opened it with a flourish. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This," Julian said, holding the document up to the light, "is a non-disclosure agreement. It details the specific penalties for accessing or sharing information regarding Voss Holdings' Nordic investments." He walked toward me, holding the paper out like a sword. "And here," he pointed to the bottom of the page, "is the signature of Melody Ann Powell, dated 3 days ago, acknowledging that she had been briefed on the confidentiality of tonight's proceedings." He turned the paper so the room could see. He turned it so I could see. I stared at the signature. It was my name. It was my loop on the M. It was my sharp cross on the T. It was a perfect replication of the hand that had signed my student loan documents, my lease, my life. But I had never seen this piece of paper before in my life. Twist, I thought, my mind racing. He didn't just forge the loan guarantor. He forged an NDA to set me up as a breached employee. He built a trapdoor under me before I even walked into the room. "She signed it," Julian declared to the crowd. "She accepted the terms, and tonight she violated them. She is not a whistleblower. She is a contract breacher. She is a disgruntled invitee trying to leverage stolen data." The Americans nodded. They understood contracts. They understood NDAs. The romance of the knighting insult had faded, replaced by the hard, cold reality of legal paperwork. They looked at me with disgust. She signed it, and then she broke it. "Get her out of here," a man at table 4 shouted. "Call the police." "Yes," Miranda Voss echoed shrilly. "Call the police." Julian looked at the security guards. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm, reasonable, authoritative, "please escort Ms. Powell off the premises and detain her until the authorities arrive. We need to press charges for theft of trade secrets." The 2 guards in black suits stepped forward. They were large men, professional and indifferent. They moved toward me with the inevitability of a landslide. I stood my ground. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced my face to remain stone. I looked at the paper in Julian's hand. I looked at the ink. "Stop," I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. The guards hesitated, just for a second. "If that is my signature," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd, "then you will have no problem submitting the original for forensic analysis." Julian smiled. "This is the original." "No," I said, stepping closer to him. I was close enough to smell the scotch on his breath. "That is a high-resolution laser print. I can see the pixelation on the letterhead from here. And the signature?" I held his gaze. "I am left-handed. Julian." Julian blinked. "I write with a hook," I said, loud enough for Soren Falk to hear. "My pen strokes go from top to bottom on the vertical lines. But that signature? The ink flow on the L and the D gets heavier at the bottom. That was written by a right-handed person trying to copy a static image. The pressure points are inverted." The room went quiet again. The specific, technical detail hung in the air. And, I added, if you check the timestamp on the metadata of that file, which I am sure my lawyer will request in discovery, you will find it was created, what, this afternoon? After you realized I might be a problem? Julian's smile froze. It didn't drop, but it stiffened. It was a micro-expression, a tiny flicker of the eyelid, a tightening of the jaw muscle. He had made a mistake. He had focused on the image of the signature, not the biomechanics of the hand that wrote it. He was a big-picture guy, and he had just tripped over a detail. It was a small hesitation, maybe half a second. But Soren Falk saw it. I saw the silver-haired man at table 1 lean forward. His eyes narrowed. He was a man who looked for cracks in the foundation, and he had just seen a hairline fracture appear in Julian's facade. "She is delusional," Julian said quickly, pulling the paper back. "Security, remove her, now." The guards took another step. One of them reached for my arm. "I wouldn't do that," a voice said. It came from the edge of the room. It was a woman's voice, cool and dry. We all turned. Dana Mercer stepped out of the shadows near the service entrance. She wasn't wearing a party dress. She was wearing her severe black suit. She looked like an executioner who had brought her own axe. She walked toward the center of the room. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at me. She looked at the security guards. "I am Dana Mercer," she announced, "Associate Counsel, and I advise you not to touch Ms. Powell unless you want to be named as co-defendants in a lawsuit for false imprisonment and spoliation of evidence." She reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small black digital recorder. She held it up. The red light was not blinking. It was solid. It was ready. "Julian," Dana said, turning to him with a look of utter boredom, "you really should be more careful about who you talk to in hallways. The walls here are very thin. And some of us have been taking notes for a very long time." Julian looked at Dana. He looked at the recorder. He looked at the fake NDA in his hand. For the first time all night, the hunter looked like he realized he had walked into the cage. The standoff in the center of the ballroom felt like a tableau frozen in time. Dana Mercer stood with her digital recorder held high, a black monolith of evidence. Julian Voss stood with his fake non-disclosure agreement. His face a rictus of crumbling arrogance. The security guards were paralyzed, caught between the orders of their employer and the legal threat of an attorney who looked ready to burn the building down. I watched Julian's eyes. They were darting frantically, looking for an exit, looking for an ally, looking for anything that could shore up the dam that had just burst. Then, the chair at table 1 scraped against the floor. It was a harsh, deliberate sound. Soren Falk stood up. He did not rush. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had seen enough of a bad play and decided to walk out of the theater. He picked up a leather folio from the table, tucked it under his arm, and walked into the center of the confrontation. "Julian," Soren said. His voice was not loud, but it had the density of lead. It stopped the air in the room. "Stop. You are talking too much." Julian spun around, his relief palpable. He thought he had found a savior. "Soren," Julian breathed, stepping toward him. "Thank God. You see what is happening? This woman, she is unstable. She is trying to sabotage the deal. I am handling it. Security is removing her." Soren raised a hand. He didn't touch Julian. He didn't have to. The gesture was a wall. "You are not handling anything," Soren said. "You are digging." He turned his back on Julian completely, dismissing him as a threat, and turned to face me. He looked at me with that same intensity I had felt earlier, but now there was no question in it. There was only recognition. "Ms. Powell," Soren said, bowing his head slightly. It was a mark of respect that made the room gasp. "It is a pleasure to finally put a face to the syntax." I nodded. "Mr. Falk, I assume the implementation of the revised liability clauses went well last quarter?" "It did," Soren replied. "It saved us approximately 12 million kroner in litigation costs." Julian let out a strangled laugh. What? What are you talking about? She's a translator. Soren. She translates toaster manuals. She doesn't know anything about liability clauses. Soren sighed. It was a sound of deep, profound disappointment. He opened the leather folio he was carrying. He pulled out a thick, bound document. The cover was heavy cream cardstock, embossed with the logo of the Falk-Hansen Sovereign Fund. This, Soren announced to the room, his voice carrying effortlessly, is the Falk-Hansen Standard for International Contract Terminology. It is the playbook my fund uses for every deal exceeding $50 million. It is the gold standard for maritime and trade law in the North Sea. He opened the document to the very last page, the acknowledgement section. Read it, Julian, Soren said, thrusting the page toward him. Julian looked down. I saw his eyes scan the page. I saw the moment he found my name. Lead Linguistic Consultant, Melody A. Powell, Soren read aloud, his voice ringing through the silence. For her work in reconciling archaic Hanseatic trade terms with modern European Union compliance standards, the room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. She wrote the book you are trying to quote, Julian, Soren said simply. And she wrote it better than you could ever hope to speak it. Julian stepped back, shaking his head. No, she faked this. She must have hacked your files. She is a spy. Remember? She inserted her name. Julian, Soren said, his voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze water. I received the final manuscript of this protocol 2 years ago. I approved the payment for her consultancy fees myself. That was 6 months before you ever met Sloane Powell, before you ever knew this family existed. He looked at Julian with pity. You cannot fake a timeline, Julian, and you cannot fake competence. Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. The spy narrative had just been obliterated. I wasn't a thief stealing his secrets. I was the architect of the very language he was trying to use to impress his investors. Dana Mercer stepped forward then. She clicked a button on her recorder. The sound was tinny, but unmistakable. It was Julian's voice, echoing from the small speaker, magnified by the silence of the room. I do not care about the regulatory delay. You tell them the liquidity is there. Tell them Voss Holdings is guaranteeing the bridge loan personally. The recording continued. I am putting on the show. I am speaking the language. I am charming the board. And then, the part that made the air turn poisonous. If she steps out of line, I will bury her. I have the lawyers to make sure she never works again. She is just a piece of furniture. Anyway, Dana clicked the stop button. That was recorded 35 minutes ago, Dana said. In the service hallway, it confirms premeditated malice, intent to defraud investors regarding liquidity, and a conspiracy to harm the reputation of a private citizen. She looked at the security guards. Still want to remove her? She asked. The guards stepped back. They looked at Julian, then at Conrad Voss, and effectively resigned from their duties on the spot. They retreated to the wall, becoming statues again. At table 1, the remaining 6 members of the Nordic delegation stood up. It was a synchronized movement. As if they shared a single mind, there was no shouting. There was no throwing of napkins or overturning of chairs. It was far more terrifying than that. They simply picked up their phones. They picked up their clutches, and they turned toward the door. They didn't look at Julian. They didn't look at Conrad. They walked past the head table as if it were empty space. It was the cold shoulder in its most literal, historical form. In the Nordic culture of business, you do not scream at a man who has no honor. You erase him. You remove your presence because his presence is no longer valid. Wait, Julian cried out, reaching toward them. Wait, please. This is a misunderstanding. We can discuss the terms. The valuation is solid. Soren Falk was the last to leave. He stopped in front of Julian. He looked at the man who had thought he could buy the world with a fake smile and a few practiced phrases. The deal is dead, Julian, Soren said. You can't do that, Julian shouted, his voice cracking, sweat beading on his forehead. We have a verbal agreement. We have a handshake on the 250 million. We do not, Soren corrected. We had an agreement based on the premise of character. You have none. Soren looked around the room, at the elite of Washington society who were watching a dynasty crumble in real time. My fund does not invest in men who use humiliation as a corporate strategy, Soren declared. And we certainly do not invest in men who are outsmarted by the people they try to victimize. He turned to me one last time. He touched his hand to his chest. Ms. Powell, he said, if you are ever looking for permanent employment, call my office in Bergen. We have a shortage of people who understand the value of truth. And then he walked out. The sound of the heavy oak doors closing behind him was the loudest sound I had ever heard. For 3 seconds, the room was suspended in shock. Then, the dam broke. But it wasn't the guests who broke it. It was Conrad Voss. The patriarch of the Voss family stormed down from the head table. His face was a dark, violent shade of purple. He didn't look like a father concerned for his son. He looked like a CEO who had just watched his stock price hit zero. He reached Julian and shoved him. It wasn't a playful shove. It was a hard, physical blow to the chest that sent Julian stumbling back against the edge of table 19. You idiot, Conrad roared. You absolute, arrogant idiot. Dad, listen, Julian stammered, holding his hands up. $250 million, Conrad screamed, not caring who heard. You lost the Falk Hansen account? Do you know what this does to our liquidity? Do you know what this does to the board? I can fix it, Julian pleaded. I can call them back. I can explain she is crazy. Shut up, Conrad bellowed. They walked out. Soren Falk just called you a fraud in front of half the Senate. You didn't just lose the deal. Julian, you poisoned the well. No one in Europe will touch us after this. Conrad looked at me with pure loathing. But it wasn't the loathing of a superior anymore. It was the loathing of a man who had been beaten. He turned back to his son. Get out of my sight, Conrad spat. You are done. Do you hear me? You are off the board. You are out of the trust. I am not letting you drag this family down with your incompetence. Julian stood there, panting. His tuxedo was rumpled. His hair was disheveled. The golden boy had been stripped down to the copper wiring, and the wiring was faulty. He looked around the room. The guests were whispering, pulling away, checking their phones. The smell of failure was in the air. And in this city, failure was contagious. He had lost the money. He had lost the respect. He had lost his father's protection. He needed to win something. He needed to reclaim some scrap of power. He turned his eyes to the head table. He looked at Sloane. My sister was sitting frozen, her hands covering her mouth. She looked like a statue of grief. Julian's face twisted. It wasn't love. It wasn't even anger. It was possession. She was the last asset he had left on the ledger, the only thing he still technically owned. He marched toward her. We are leaving, he barked, reaching the table. Julian, Miranda Voss tried to intervene. Maybe we should... Quiet! Julian snapped at his mother. He looked at Sloane. Get up. We are going home. Sloane didn't move. She stared at him, her eyes wide. I said get up, Julian shouted. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. He didn't hit her. He didn't have to. The grip was tight, white-knuckled. It was a grip meant to hurt. It was a grip meant to steer. It was the way a man grabs a dog that is misbehaving. He yanked her arm, forcing her to stumble out of her chair. You are coming with me, he hissed, leaning into her face. You are my fiancé. You belong to me. And we are going to fix this mess your sister made. The room gasped. It was one thing to hear about control. It was another to see it. The violence was subtle, but it was public. It was undeniable. I took a step forward. Let her go. Julian? Stay back, Julian warned, swinging around, dragging Sloane with him. This is none of your business. This is family business. He pulled Sloane again, hard. She stumbled in her heels, almost falling. And that was the moment. The fear that had paralyzed Sloane for 3 years, the fear that had made her breathless and shallow, suddenly hit a wall. She looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked at the red marks forming on her skin. She looked at me. She saw me standing in the center of the room, alone but unbroken. She saw that I had burned down the world to save her. Something in her eyes snapped, not snapped like a twig, but snapped into place like a lock. "No," she whispered. Julian ignored her. He pulled again. "Walk. No!" Sloane screamed it. It was a guttural, raw sound. It wasn't a polite protest. It was a rejection. She planted her feet. She ripped her arm back with a strength I didn't know she had. "Let me go!" Sloane yelled. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings. Julian's hand slipped. He stumbled back, shocked. He looked at her as if his toaster had just started reciting Shakespeare. "Sloane?" he said, confused. "Don't touch me," Sloane said. She was shaking, but she was standing tall. She held her wrist, rubbing the red skin. "Do not ever touch me again." "You are making a scene," Julian hissed, lowering his voice, trying to regain control. "Stop it. You are embarrassing yourself." "I am not the one who is embarrassing myself," Sloane said. Her voice was trembling, but it was clear. "I am done, Julian. I am not going with you. I am not marrying you." She pulled the diamond ring off her finger. It was a 10-carat rock, a symbol of the heavy, cold weight of the Voss expectation. She threw it. She didn't hand it to him. She threw it. It hit him in the chest, bounced off a button, and clattered onto the marble floor, spinning noisily before coming to a stop near his shoe. "It is over," she said. Julian stared at the ring. Then he stared at her. His face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally, a cold, malignant rage. He had lost the deal. He had lost the father. Now he had lost the girl. He was naked, and a naked man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in the world. He looked at me. He looked at Sloane. He looked at my mother, who was cowering in her chair. He smiled. It was a terrible, broken smile. "Over?" Julian said softly. "You think it is over because you threw a ring?" He laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound. "You stupid, stupid girls," he said. "You think this was about love? You think this was about a wedding?" He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out his phone. "I don't need the ring," Julian said, tapping the screen. "I have the paper." He looked at my mother. "Lorraine," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Tell your daughters about the terms." My mother put her face in her hands and began to sob. "You have 30 days, Julian announced, his voice projecting to the entire room. 30 days to pay back the consolidated loan, $400,000, plus the accrued interest, plus the penalty fees for the cancellation of the wedding contract. He looked at me. "And since you are the guarantor, Melody," he said, his eyes gleaming with the promise of destruction, "since your name is on the line right next to your mother's, I am going to make sure every cent comes out of your pocket. I will garnish your wages. I will seize your assets. I will ruin your credit so thoroughly you won't be able to rent a bicycle, let alone an apartment." He stepped over the diamond ring on the floor. "You wanted to play lawyer?" Julian spat. "Fine. Welcome to the lawsuit. I am calling the debt. Tonight." The room was silent. The party was over. The champagne was warm. Julian Voss had lost the kingdom, but he had kept the keys to the dungeon, and as he stood there, promising to bury us in debt, I realized that the linguistic battle was finished. The war for our survival had just begun. The air outside the Ravenwood Club was biting, a sharp shock of February cold that felt like a physical slap after the overheated hysteria of the ballroom. We stood on the curb, 3 women in evening gowns shivering under a single street lamp, waiting for the valet to bring my mother's car. It did not feel like a victory. Victories are supposed to be loud. They are supposed to end with champagne and confetti. This felt like escaping a burning building only to realize you are standing in the snow without a coat. My mother, Lorraine, was weeping silently, her mascara creating dark, jagged rivers down her cheeks. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. A woman whose entire worldview, based on appeasement and social climbing, had just been incinerated by her own ambition. Sloane stood apart from us. She was hugging herself, rubbing her bare arms where Julian's grip had left faint red crescent marks. She wasn't crying. She was staring at the pavement, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she were trying to process the sheer magnitude of the demolition we had just caused. The valet pulled up in Mom's sedan. He looked at us, the weeping mother, the shell-shocked bride, the sister with the face of stone, and wisely said nothing. He handed me the keys. I was the only one steady enough to drive. We drove in silence for 10 minutes. The city lights of Washington, D.C., blurred past, a smear of red and white streaks. I drove toward Arlington, toward my apartment. I couldn't bear the thought of going to the family house, the house that was apparently mortgaged to the hilt, the house that Julian Voss effectively owned. When we walked into my small apartment, the contrast was jarring. The smell of old books and lemon cleaner greeted us. Sloane sat down on my sagging beige sofa, her emerald dress pooling around her like spilled ink. Mom paced the kitchen, wringing her hands, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We are ruined," Mom whispered, the words finally breaking loose. 30 days. Melody. Did you hear him? 30 days. We don't have $400,000. We don't even have 40,000. He is going to take the house. He is going to take your father's pension. I filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove. My hands were moving on autopilot. He is angry, Mom. He is lashing out. He is not just angry, Mom snapped, turning on me. He is Julian Voss. He does not make idle threats. He has the paperwork. He has the signatures. And you? You just had to antagonize him. You just had to humiliate him. He humiliated himself, I said, my voice flat. I just translated it. You provoked him, Mom cried. You could have just apologized. We could have smoothed it over. Now he will burn us to the ground just to watch the smoke. Stop it, Sloane said. It was a quiet voice, coming from the sofa. Mom ignored her. I did everything to secure this family's future. Everything. And you too? I said stop it, Sloane shouted. The room went silent. The kettle began to whistle, a high, thin shriek. I took it off the heat. Sloane stood up. She looked at Mom, and then she looked at me. The fear that had defined her face for 3 years was gone, replaced by a terrible, hollow exhaustion. It is not Melody's fault, Sloane said. It is mine. Sloane, honey, Mom started, softening her tone. You were a victim. Julian was. No, Sloane cut her off. She turned to me. Melody, do you remember when you came back from Bergen? 3 years ago? I nodded slowly. Of course. Mom called me. She said she was sick. She said it was her heart. She said she couldn't manage the house alone. Sloane let out a laugh that sounded like glass breaking. Mom wasn't sick. I froze. I looked at my mother. Lorraine looked away, finding a sudden interest in the pattern of the linoleum floor. What? I asked. Mom wasn't sick, Sloane repeated. I was the one who was sick. I was sick with fear. Julian had just started, changing. It wasn't physical at first. It was the way he checked my phone, the way he told me what to wear, the way he isolated me from my friends. I was drowning. Melody, I was 21 and I was terrified. She took a step toward me. I begged Mom to call you. Sloane confessed. I told her I couldn't handle him alone. I told her I needed you here. I needed a shield. I knew Julian was intimidated by you, by your intelligence, by your seriousness. I thought if you were here, he would back off. I thought you could protect me. I stared at her. The room seemed to tilt. For 3 years, I had carried the weight of a lost destiny. I had mourned my research grant, my life in Norway, my career as a scholar. I had told myself it was a noble sacrifice. I had given it up because my mother was dying, because my family needed me in a crisis of health. It was a lie. I hadn't sacrificed my future for a tragedy. I had sacrificed it for a strategy. "You brought me back," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "To be a buffer?" "I was a coward," Sloane whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I am so sorry, Mel. I was so scared. And then, once you were here, he did back off a little. He focused his cruelty on you instead of me. And I let him, because it meant I could breathe." I looked at my mother. "And you went along with it? You told me you had a heart condition." "I did have palpitations." Mom defended herself weakly. "The stress." And Sloane was falling apart. "We needed you." "Melody, does it matter why?" "Yes," I said. "It matters." I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark street. A police siren wailed in the distance. I felt a cold anger settling in my gut, hardening like concrete. My life hadn't been derailed by fate. It had been derailed by the people in this room. My family had treated me like a resource to be harvested, a sandbag to be thrown against the flood. But there was no time to mourn the past. The flood was still rising. "We can talk about forgiveness later," I said, turning back to them. "Right now, we have to survive. Mom, the debt. Show me everything." Mom hesitated, then opened her clutch and pulled out her phone. She forwarded me the emails, the PDFs, the toxic paper trail of our bondage. I sat down at my small desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed blue in the dim room. I started pulling up the documents, the loan agreement, the promissory note, the guarantor forms. I zoomed in on the signature page of the main loan, $400,000. It was a consolidation of credit card debt, a second mortgage, and what looked like a personal line of credit for lifestyle maintenance. My mother had been spending money we didn't have to keep up appearances for a society that didn't care about us. But then I looked at the lender. The debt wasn't held by a bank. It wasn't held by Chase or Wells Fargo. It was held by an entity called Voss Norcap Holdings, LLC. I opened a new tab. I searched for the company registration. It was a Delaware shell company. Incorporated 6 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm in DRC. I dug deeper, accessing a public database of corporate filings I used for my translation work. Voss Norcap Holdings, LLC, Manager, J. Voss, Purpose, Asset Acquisition and Intellectual Property Management. I stopped. Intellectual Property Management. Why would a company holding personal debt for a country club widow be interested in intellectual property? Mom didn't have intellectual property. She had a house full of depreciating furniture and a closet full of old dresses. I went back to the loan agreement. I scrolled past the payment schedules, past the interest rates, down to the fine print of the collateral section, Clause 14B, in the event of default. The guarantor, secondary, agrees to assign all current and future rights, titles, and interests in any and all written works, academic papers, translation schemas, and linguistic methodologies to the lender as partial satisfaction of the debt. My blood ran cold. The secondary guarantor, that was me. I looked at the signature next to my name. It was the same forgery I had seen on the NDA, the same heavy bottom loop, the same right-handed pressure. "Twist," I whispered. "What is it?" Sloane asked, wiping her eyes. "It wasn't about the money," I said, looking up at them. "Julian doesn't need $400,000. That is pocket change to him. He spends that on catering." "Then why?" Mom asked. "He needs me," I said. "Or rather, he needs my work." I turned the laptop so they could see. Soren Falk mentioned the Falk-Hansen standard. I explained. "It is the contract terminology I developed. It is the industry standard for Nordic trade. Julian is trying to break into that market. He just tried to close a $250 million deal, but to operate in that space, His contracts need to be compliant. He needs the lexicon. He needs the usage rights. I don't understand, Sloane said. If he owns the rights to my work, I said, the pieces clicking together. He doesn't just save on consulting fees. He controls the standard. He can rewrite the terms to favor Voss Holdings. He can block competitors from using the verified terminology. He wanted to force us into default so he could seize my intellectual property. He wanted to own your brain, Sloane whispered, horrified. He forged my signature on a loan, I said. Knowing Mom couldn't pay it back, he set a trap that would trigger the moment the engagement ended or the moment the money ran out. He was going to take my career, my research, my name, and bury it inside his shell company. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Dana Mercer. Audio file secured. Uploaded to 3 cloud servers and sent to a secure Dropbox at the Department of Justice. Timestamp verified. He admitted to the forgery on tape when he said he had the paperwork to bury you. We have him on extortion. A second message came through immediately after. Unknown number. Country code +47. Norway, Ms. Powell. This is Soren Falk. I have just instructed my legal team to freeze all pending transfers to Voss Holdings. If he attempts to sue you for defamation or debt collection, I will fly to Washington personally. I despise men who use language to strip dignity. You have the full backing of the Falk-Hansen legal department. Call me tomorrow. I stared at the screen. A wave of relief washed over me. But it wasn't the soft relief of safety. It was the hard, cold relief of ammunition. He can't touch us, I said. Mom looked up, hopeful but terrified. What? Dana has the recording, I said. She has him threatening to ruin us. She has him admitting that he views us as assets. And Soren Falk, the man Julian was terrified of, is backing me. He knows the signature is fake. He knows the IP clause is predatory. So we don't have to pay? Mom asked. Oh, we have to pay the principal, I said grimly. We spent the money. Mom, that is the reality. We will have to sell the house. We will have to downsize. We will have to live like normal people instead of pretending to be aristocracy. Mom paled. But she didn't argue. She looked at Sloane. She looked at the wreckage of the night. She nodded. But we won't pay the interest, I continued. And we won't pay the penalties. And he will never, ever own my work. Sloane stood up. She walked over to the desk. She looked at the screen. At the clause that had been designed to enslave her sister. She reached into her purse. She didn't pull out a tissue. She pulled out a small velvet box. The ring box. She had thrown the ring at him, but she had kept the box. I kept the receipt, Sloane said softly, for the watch I bought him, the Patek Philippe. It cost $80,000. I put it on my credit card. Return it, I said. I will, she said, and I'm going to sell the dresses, the jewelry, everything he bought me. She looked at me. Her eyes were clear for the first time in years. I want to be me again. Melody, she said. I don't want to be a Voss. I don't want to be a doll. I want to be the sister you thought you were coming home to save. I reached out and took her hand. It was warm. We have a lot of work to do, I said. He won't go down quietly. He will sue. He will slander. He will try to use the press. Let him, I said. I looked at the stack of books on my shelf. The grammar guides, the law texts, the tools of my trade. For 3 years, I had been the invisible woman. I had been the translator, the one who takes someone else's voice and makes it understandable. I had hidden behind the words of others, no more. I am not asking for permission to be seen anymore, I said to the room, but mostly to myself. He wanted a war of words? He wanted to use the law as a weapon? I closed the laptop with a snap. I am going to write the closing argument of his life. 3 months later, the war ended not on a battlefield, but in a conference room on K Street that smelled of lemon polish and billable hours. This was not a criminal court with a jury of peers. This was commercial arbitration, the private justice system of the wealthy. where the goal is rarely truth, but rather the quietest possible disposal of a problem. The table was a slab of mahogany long enough to land a plane on. On one side sat Julian Voss and a phalanx of 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than my mother's car. On the other side sat me, Dana Mercer, and my mother. Sloane was not there. I had insisted she stay home. This was the demolition phase, and I did not want her to inhale the dust. Julian looked different. The golden tan had faded into a sallow, office-bound gray. He had lost weight, and his eyes carried a permanent restlessness, darting around the room as if he expected a trap door to open beneath his feet, but his arrogance was intact. It was the only thing holding him upright. He didn't look at me. He looked at the mediator, a retired federal judge with a face like a dried apple doll. "We are here to finalize the settlement regarding the outstanding liabilities of Mrs. Lorraine Powell," Julian's lead counsel said. He was a man with a voice like gravel. "Mr. Voss is prepared to offer a restructuring of the $400,000 principal. However, this offer is contingent upon the execution of a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement by all parties, specifically regarding the events of January 29th. I looked at the document they slid across the table. It wasn't a settlement. It was a gag order wrapped in a payment plan. It demanded that we never speak of the Ravenwood Club, never speak of the forged signatures, and never disparage the business practices of Voss Holdings. If we signed, we would spend the next 10 years paying him back in silence. If we didn't, he would sue us for immediate repayment and bankruptcy." Julian finally looked at me. He smirked. It was a small, tight expression. He thought he still held the whip. He thought that because the bank account was his, the power was his. "It is a generous offer, Melody," Julian said softly. "You should take it, before I decide to double the interest rate." I picked up the document. I didn't read it. I set it aside. "We are not signing this," I said. Julian's lawyer sighed, leaning forward. "Ms. Powell, your mother has admitted to the debt. You are the guarantor. You have no leverage here. If we go to litigation, you will lose everything." "I am not the guarantor," I corrected him. "And we are not here to discuss my mother's spending habits. We are here to discuss a pattern of fraud that extends far beyond a family loan." I opened my laptop. I connected it to the large screen at the end of the room. "What is this?" Julian snapped. "This is not part of the discovery. It is rebuttal evidence," Dana Mercer said calmly. "Sit down." "Julian." On the screen, I projected a series of documents. They were side-by-side comparisons of contracts. On the left were the original Norwegian texts from Julian's previous deals. On the right were the English translations filed with the American regulatory bodies. "For the past 3 months," I began, my voice steady, "I have been conducting a linguistic audit of Voss Norcap Holdings' external contracts. I found something interesting." I pointed to the screen. "In the Norwegian originals," I explained, "the term used for liability cap is ansvarsbegrensning. It is a standard term, but in 3 separate instances, the English translation filed by Julian's team renders this as conditional liability, citing a vague, non-existent precedent." I looked at the mediator. "This is not a translation error, Your Honor. This is a deliberate linguistic manipulation. By changing the term, Mr. Voss shifted the financial risk from his holding company to his Scandinavian partners without them realizing it until the ink was dry. He has been defrauding his investors through translation." Julian slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. She is a disgruntled relative. She is not a forensic accountant." "No," I said. "I am a linguist, and I know that conditional liability does not exist in the Hanseatic Commercial Code. You made it up, Julian, just like you made up your fluency." Julian's lawyers were whispering frantically to each other. They hadn't prepared for this. They had prepared for a sobbing mother and a broke sister. They hadn't prepared for a seminar on international contract fraud. "This is irrelevant," Julian's lead counsel argued, though he looked pale. "We are here about the loan." "It goes to character," Dana Mercer interjected. And it goes to the validity of the signatures he claims bind my client. Dana pressed a button on her laptop. The room filled with the sound of the recording from the Ravenwood hallway. If she steps out of line, I will bury her. She is just a piece of furniture. Anyway. The voice was clear, hateful, and undeniably Julian. That establishes intent, Dana said. He wasn't collecting a debt. He was orchestrating a takeover of Miss Powell's intellectual property by manufacturing a default. Julian stood up. I have had enough of this. We are leaving. See you in court. Sit down. Julian, a voice said from the doorway. The door opened. Soren Falk walked in. He was not alone. He was flanked by two men in dark suits, carrying briefcases with the seal of the Financial Supervisory Authority of Norway. Julian froze. He looked at Soren, then at the men behind him. The blood drained from his face so completely that he looked like a wax figure. Mr. Falk, Julian's lawyer stammered. We were not expecting you. I invited myself, Soren said, walking to the table. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the mediator. I am submitting an amicus brief on behalf of the Falk-Hansen Sovereign Fund. He placed a heavy file on the table. My fund has completed its investigation into Voss Norcap Holdings, Soren announced. We have found irregularities consistent with the linguistic fraud Miss Powell described. We have forwarded our findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission and their counterparts in Oslo. He turned to Julian. If you proceed with this extortion attempt against the Powell family, Soren said quietly, I will authorize the release of the full report to the public domain this afternoon. Every bank in the Western Hemisphere will blacklist you before dinner. Julian sank back into his chair. He looked small. The bravado evaporated, leaving behind a terrified child who had broken something expensive. But, Soren continued, there is one more thing. He gestured to me. I pulled out the final piece of evidence, the twist that would cut the last string. The non-disclosure agreement, I said, holding up the blue folder Julian had waved around at the party. The one you used to accuse me of espionage. The one you claimed I signed 3 days before the event. I slid a forensic report across the table to the mediator. We had the document analyzed, I said. The paper stock contains a microscopic tracking dot, a printer's stenography code. It tells us exactly when and where that page was printed. I looked at Julian. It was printed at 5:45 in the afternoon on the day of the party, I said. From the printer in your office at the club, 2 hours after I had already arrived. And the signature? I pointed to the blown-up image on the screen. It is a digital clone, I said. You lifted it from the guest registry where I signed in at the gate. You copy-pasted it onto the NDA, printed it out, and brought it into the ballroom to frame me. The room was silent. Fraud, forgery, extortion. It wasn't just a bad business deal anymore. It was a criminal enterprise. Julian's lead lawyer closed his folder. He moved his chair slightly away from Julian, a physical distancing that spoke volumes. He knew the ship was sinking, and he wasn't going down with it. We are done here, the lawyer said. We need a recess. No recess. Conrad Voss's voice came over the speakerphone in the center of the table. We hadn't realized he was listening in. Dad? Julian whispered. You are a fool. Julian. Conrad's voice was cold, distorted by the static, but heavy with finality. I told you to fix this. Instead, you brought the Norwegians to our doorstep. Dad, I can explain. Silence, Conrad commanded. Here is the settlement. Voss Norcap Holdings will forgive 50% of the principal debt immediately. The remaining balance will be restructured as a standard personal loan with 0% interest. Payable over 10 years, there will be no NDA, there will be no gag order. But Dad, and Julian, Conrad continued, ignoring him. Effective immediately. You are removed from the operations of the European Division. You will resign from the board. You are going to spend the next few years managing our charitable foundation in Montana, far away from anyone who speaks Norwegian. Julian put his head in his hands. It was over. He wasn't going to jail. Men like him rarely do. But he was being exiled. He was losing the only thing that mattered to him, his proximity to power. The mediator looked at me. "Ms. Powell, do you accept these terms?" I looked at my mother. She was crying again, but these were tears of relief. She nodded frantically. I looked at Soren Falk. He gave me a small, imperceptible nod. "We accept," I said. "On one condition." "Name it," Conrad's voice said. "Clause 14b?" I said. "The intellectual property assignment. It is void. Permanently. You acknowledge that you have no claim to my work, my research, or my future." "Agreed," Conrad said instantly. "Draft it." The meeting ended 20 minutes later. The lawyers scuttled out like cockroaches avoiding the light. Julian remained in his chair, staring at the mahogany grain, a man who had tried to buy a legacy and ended up with an exile. I walked out into the lobby with Dana and Soren. The sun was shining through the glass walls, bright and blinding. "That was impressive," Soren said, buttoning his coat. "You dismantled him with a prepositional phrase." "He dismantled himself," I said. "I just turned on the lights." Soren reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. It was heavy, cream-colored, and simple. Fjordhaven Contract Institute. "We are a new think tank," Soren said, "based in Bergen, but with offices in DRC. We focus on the ethics of international trade language. We need a director of legal linguistics." He handed me the card. "The salary is significant," he said, "but more importantly, the work is real. No more toaster manuals. Melody. We write the rules that keep men like Julian Voss in check." I took the card. I ran my thumb over the embossed lettering. For years, I had let my family dictate my worth. I had hidden my talent to keep the peace. I had translated everyone else's story but my own. "I accept," I said. Sloane was waiting for us in the car. When I told her the news, she didn't scream. She just closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. She had already returned the ring. She had sold the dresses. She was working part-time at a veterinary clinic, sweeping floors and learning the trade she had actually wanted before the world told her to be a trophy. My mother sold the big house a month later. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a liquidation. She bought a condo in a cheaper zip code. She complained about the space, but for the first time in her life, she slept through the night because she wasn't waiting for a foreclosure notice. As for me, I packed my books. The grammar guides, the law texts, the history of the Hanseatic League. I didn't pack them into boxes for storage. I packed them for my new office. I walked out of the apartment in Arlington one last time. I left the beige walls behind. I left the silence behind. I am Melody Powell. I am not a sister. I am not a guarantor. I am the woman who speaks the language of truth. And for the first time in my life, I am finally part of the conversation. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. It is amazing to connect with all of you from different corners of the world. If you enjoyed seeing the truth come to light, please subscribe to the Jane Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people who need to hear it. Stay strong and never let anyone silence your voice.